Oh, you have a photographer in the crowd. He's just been drinking a lot of beers. It's going to be good. I love it. What's on this? What else to ask? I'll introduce this to you.
I haven't sent you that thing yet, sorry.
Don't you worry.
Send it. Yeah, we're ready. Let's go. Hello. Oh, sorry about that. Hello, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, more gentlemen than we thought would come, which is very good. We realized that our life-work balance is a little unbalanced in terms of gender, so we're going to try to open it up as quickly as possible, and we hope that men will participate, because there's no point in having these conversations if men don't. Like all great ideas, the idea for this panel was born in a bar at Brufani last year in Perugia, where Hannah Storm, who is the director of the Ethical Journalism Network, and Emily Golgoski, who is, leads research, she's director of research at the Membership Puzzle, and myself, we were talking about who was watching our children while we were all drinking in Perugia. And that led us to a further discussion of sort of trying to manage life and work, and especially life and work in the industry like ours. So we decided we couldn't have that conversation without Rachel Korp, who is at the end of the table, and she leads a team of about 250 people, at ITV News. So, and my name is Natalia Antelava. I'm a journalist and co-founder of Kodo Story, and I am completely unqualified to talk about work and life balance, because I don't know what that is. And I think that's the case for many journalists. You don't go into journalism if you want to be home at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock. Journalism life balance doesn't seem to be very compatible with Brexit or Trump or all the pressures of modern day journalism. So I think, to get straight into it, and I want to start with Hannah. Hannah, do you think, is there much point, given that it's so hard to sort of find that balance, is there much point in talking about the balance? Is it a right way of framing the conversation to begin with?
Oh, I've got two now, a choice of two. A couple of things I'd say is that I was raised in the era of Margaret Thatcher in the UK, where we were told as women that we could have it all, right? As far as I'm concerned, that is utter nonsense, okay? It's absolute utter nonsense. And it's really damaging, I think, for people, doesn't matter what their gender, to give this perception that they are the superhero, you know, that they're superwoman. I think that often if you give that impression, the reality is that your superwoman cape is stuck down your underwear, or it's covered in the vomit of the kids, or it hasn't been washed for 6 weeks because you haven't had the time. But I do think that there is a way of navigating this so actually you find something that works for you. And to that point, the best conversation I've ever heard around this great imbalance of balance was at Poynter, the Poynter Institute last year in the States, where I occasionally do consultancy, and there was another lady called Kristen Hare teaching, and she talked about chemistry. She said, find your chemistry, find your magic potion, your magic collection of things that works for you. And I think that is the most helpful, for me at least, the most helpful concept in terms of finding some balance.
And I think we'll get to sort of the practical bits. I think it will be helpful if this is as practical as it can be. But Emily, do you agree with that? Do you agree, and do you have any tips on sort of finding the chemistry?
Thank you. First, I'm really pleased for those of you who have joined us to really take a moment to talk about sustainable ideas to keep people contributing to this important and very difficult work. We know how network-driven this industry is, and so I just appreciate the chance to talk about this in person. As journalism jobs are increasingly in demand, or fewer in supply, we see that more people are moving away from their support systems in the same years they may be having and raising children, and increasingly taking care of aging or elderly loved ones. And some of the things that are front of mind for me are the importance of us advocating for flexible work time, remote work, sick days for family members, not just sick days for yourself, but I think for those of us in the US and other parts of the world, taking a nod from our European colleagues to say, we actually need sick days that are allocated for other people that we're giving care to. And that's vitally important. But as caregivers, we can't do that alone. And I just want to give a nod to my friend Erica Owens from Open News, who is an amazing ally and talks about the importance of being one in the workplace and as a manager. Of just two other things that are front of mind on this topic. Creating more places to bring our families. Journalism, as we know, is a field where often big decisions are made late at night and at the bar, and so it can feel easy to be sort of left out of the conversation if you have other commitments outside of the workplace. One thing that my former colleagues at the New York Times and I did, knowing we were never at happy hour, was actually finding opportunities on the weekends to get to meet where we could bring our kids. So we still are craving not just that, like the social, like let your hair down, have a candid conversation with a colleague, but also tell me about what you're working on and here's how I might be able to contribute to it. We called it the Brooklyn Bureau. And just one other thing, I really want to call on Perugia, the amazing gathering that this is, to have or to consider on-site childcare in coming years, because I think it's critically important when it comes to making sure that more people can be sort of at this table.
Yeah, I couldn't second that more, and it's a great idea. Everyone should tweet about it. We should create a hashtag. There are definitely sort of practical steps. But Rachel, can you talk a little bit? You try to do all this thing, and then Brexit happens, and there is no end to Brexit either. And then the reality of like a newsroom sets in. Do you think there are ways that newsrooms and management in newsrooms can make it easier for people not to burn out?
Yeah, I might come back to the Brexit thing in a minute, but I would say we have fantastic jobs. We have really fun jobs, and we're quite privileged in a way to do a career that's so interesting, that takes us around the world, takes us into people's houses, takes us places we would never go. And I'm not even talking about the glamorous places, and you know all of that. And I think we have got to remember that. These are great jobs that we choose to do, and we work too hard, and we probably play too hard, and we have a lot of friends who are probably journalists as well, and we do live and breathe our jobs. And that's not such a bad thing, but you do certainly need to bring in balance and ways to stop the burnout. And I said I'll come back to Brexit in a minute, but at ITN, where I work, we have done quite a few initiatives recently. They've been growing over the years, but we were forced, some of you may know this, but government brought in legislation that we had to publish gender pay gaps in any companies over a certain size in the UK. So we had to publish ours, and we weren't proud of it. I don't think anybody's proud of theirs. Certainly a lot of media organisations had the same issues. And it made us just rethink some of the ways we work. And this is not just about women, and this is not just about working parents. I think this is what we're keen to think about. But it's just about work-life balance. So we've realised that we didn't advertise every single job as part-time or possibly flexible. We just thought people would apply and then ask, and realised that a whole load of people just weren't applying for good jobs. So we now spell that out, and it sounds obvious, but we do that, and that makes a difference. We've also brought in something we call summer family leave, where anybody can apply. Not everybody gets it every year, but can apply to have August off. And we make sure that their pay is spread out over the year, so you're not suddenly working without pay, off without pay. And we've got lots of men who are doing this to spend time with their children. We've got grandmothers who've applied to spend time with their grandchildren. And this is to just try and make the year a bit more bearable. We've also been quite proactive in shared parental leave. So it's not just the mother taking the leave. Quite often dads take a bit of time with mothers as well, so they can spend time with their children. Is actually a really nice, positive thing to do, not just about childcare. And we also do quite a lot of coaching of people coming back into the workplace if they've been off, to try and make them feel they're not slipping behind. But that's a lot of that was around gender, but certainly with Brexit, it's been a really difficult one, and I imagine this is what it's like with Trump. You usually, on a big story, you build up to it and you know there's an end point. So you're on high adrenaline and you're all working ridiculous hours and you know at the end of it, it's fine, I'm going to have some downtime. Well, we keep being marched up to that, and then it gets delayed, and it gets delayed, and it's been delayed again, and I still don't know when it's going to happen, if it's going to happen. And that's really hard to sustain. And there's a lot of people across British media who are kind of at cracking point, and we do have to discuss it, because no one wants to leave the story either. So certainly, as we go into Easter holidays, we're making people take their holiday. We can't all keep working, and we're talking about it a lot. And a lot of it is just allowing people to say, do you know what? I am exhausted. I'm going to come in at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, not 8 o'clock.
Yeah, as I said, I think it's important to open up, so think of your questions. I think we might give slight preference to men to start with, just because we are a women panel. But just picking up on that point, Hannah, you have written so eloquently about vulnerability and the importance of showing vulnerability. And I think that is that as well, kind of making people aware that, you know, it's time to take a step back. Can you just say?
Sure. Thanks. So the job I used to do was the director of the International News Safety Institute. And for me, safety is not just about physical safety, it's about digital safety and emotional safety as well. And I've written about a sexual assault that happened to me and how I finally wrote about it last year, but I then wrote about how I navigated that. And for me, it was really important to put out the fact that I felt vulnerable, because by being able to claim that vulnerability, it gave me a sense of power. So that was really important. The other thing that I'd just like to mention is that this sense of burnout that comes up time and time again, and specifically over the last few years it's come up. And one of the reasons I think, aside from this uncertainty that we're all dealing with, is that we are all hyper-connected. So we're connected all the time, right? We all have FOMO, fear of missing out. But what I want to put to people is actually we need to be more scared of FOBO, which is fear of burnout, than FOMO. Right? And that's my kind of, I thought about that in bed this morning. I was like, that's a good one, right? Really good one. But I do think we need to be more aware of, you know, burnout, and we can actually give ourselves permission to say, let's stop, let's press pause. What is the worst that is absolutely going to happen if I don't check my phone 15 times in the next 20 minutes? Honestly, we will survive. Somehow we will survive. There's just one more point I'd like to make on vulnerability, is that I managed to find a way, and I haven't obviously got the answer because otherwise I'd be like totally zen. I found a way to identify little islands. I started going to therapy last year to find little islands or stepping stones I could look forward to. Cool things where it doesn't have to be big. It could be like going for a date with my husband, who occasionally sees me, or like taking the kids out somewhere, or buying a book I really liked. You know, those kind of things, almost like little rewards. Or I do a lot of running, so like finding a running race to do. Things that I could plot in front of me so I didn't feel overwhelmed. And that was really, really helpful, and it has been really helpful for me as well.
That's great. Any questions from the audience, or anything that you want to... Anything anyone wants to say? Yeah, let's start with you in the back. No men are raising hands, so that's fine.
Hello, I'm Sylvia Loder. I'm a Czech journalist. I work for a magazine called Respect. First of all, thank you, because I started to feel like I'm the only one going slightly crazy recently, because the pressure, and I'm sure all the journalists here, we share the similar stories, but I feel like the pressure gets more and more intense, and there are more directions from the pressure comes to you. And for instance, I noticed that during the festival, the question of online harassment was discussed quite a lot. And I cover gender issues quite a lot, and Czech Republic, despite its quite interesting history in this sense, is slightly, still quite very conservative country. And I get so much, pardon my French, so much shit online towards me. and also it's not the most financially beneficial jobs. Let's agree, and it's getting slightly worse. So you're forced to take sort of side jobs just to maintain a decent lifestyle. So I feel like it's getting harder and harder and harder. And I actually don't have a question. I just wanted to first of all to thank you to just open this topic. But I do have a question, and you open it a little bit with the stepping stones. But what really are the strategies? Really just separate the job sometimes and then just go away, or what really are, what does it help? What does help look like in this sense? How do you keep your sanity basically and your life in check? Thank you.
Please, yeah, jump in.
This is a tiny little tactic. It's not something for every day, but at the moment where you're like, I literally cannot do one more thing, the whole thing feels out of control. I keep a folder on my computer of screenshots and emails of compliments and nice things that I valued that people have shared with me. So at the risk of sounding like, oh, I just need to feel like, it becomes almost this island, like this place to say, okay, even when things feel so incredibly chaotic, and even when I'm trying to co-parent a small child in an expensive city on a deadline, that can be sort of this nice respite. There are also a number, because this is such a wonderful chance to get to see friends, but that's frankly the exception and not the rule. So there's a few people I follow online who I find to just be like very straightforward about their own struggles. One of them is Heather Bryant, who would be here, but she's caring for a loved one. I would definitely check out her Twitter. It's at HBC Compass, and I just find her to be like so refreshing and wonderful. Slate has a parenting podcast called Mom and Dad Are Fighting. That's another good one. And then there's another great show from Catherine Goldstein called Double Shift that is a really thoughtful analysis. I didn't answer your question at all, but just a few thoughts.
Sorry, just a couple of brief things. Switch off. It's okay to switch off. With online harassment against women, one of the biggest, we've done a lot of work, a colleague on the front row, Julie Peseta, and I have done a lot of work around online harassment of women. It's important to acknowledge that you can shut off, you can stop for a moment, you can disconnect, you can breathe, you can get some sleep, you can get some fresh air. It's all okay. It will be okay. You don't have to be perfect. You only have to be good enough. That's what my auntie told me once. And just, can I put this in your inbox, in your folder thing? Emily, there was only one way I could get to New York for my last business meeting for my previous job, because I have a 12-year-old and a 3-year-old, and there was nobody else to care for my 12-year-old. So the only way I could get to New York, which sounds a bit flash, was to take the 12-year-old with me. But there was no way I could get through this 4-hour meeting unless I could rely on a friend. And I emailed Emily and a friend Lou, and I was like, hey, ladies, any chance you could help me, please, and, have 2 hours with 12-year-old, and Lou have 2 hours with 12-year-old, and they were like, oh my God, this would be amazing. We can't think of anything better. So actually, it's thanks in a way to people you meet on this road who are experiencing the same thing that you somehow managed to navigate this minefield, as it were.
Can I add something as well?
Yeah.
I think we all have our little short-term coping mechanisms that you run, I run, or whether you go and not answer emails all weekend. I think as well you need to think about your career as a whole as well, and the whole of it doesn't have to be lived at this intensity. And there might be times when your career is doing that. There's times when it's just fine to coast for a bit, or even take a sabbatical or go traveling for a year. We have those sorts of jobs where that's okay and that's not frowned on, and you will hit another bit that goes like that, but it doesn't have to be like that for 40 years.
Can I just... We'll come to you next, but sort of reflecting back on the conversation that we had and on the point that you just made about taking your daughter to New York. My husband recently went to London and had a bunch of business meetings, and he took our son with him, and he brought him with him to his meetings, and that was wonderful. But there is just no way I would ever do that. I would never, ever bring a child to business meetings with me, which is very sad.
That's a fear of being judged.
And that's a fear of being judged. And do you have any advice on how do we begin to change that? Do we just bring them along, or, and where do you start?
That's really difficult. I don't know. I'm probably the same as you. I mean, yes is the answer. We ought to. And it's interesting that everybody cheered when we talked about childcare for this. Maybe we need to be rethinking all of that and the culture of that. And there are some places that are not appropriate for kids. And there's some, I've taken mine into work and they've sat in many a meeting. But there are some that we can't take them to because we're discussing things that children shouldn't be hearing. So I don't know. It's a balance. I'm interested to hear what other people think really as well.
Just on the conference point, again, Julie Peseta, who's like one of my best buddies now because we navigate this trickiness together sometimes, is last year we went to a conference. It was the WANIFA conference in Portugal, and in many ways it was a fantastic conference. In some ways it wasn't so fantastic. A group of us ended up writing a note, 10 people, not ladies, not all of us, some were men as well, from around the world, giving some suggestions to how it could be more inclusive to women and more diverse as well. And one of the suggestions was that we include childcare to make those expert voices that we don't hear so often, to make it easier for them. And it wasn't just for women, obviously it was for men too, but to make that more inclusive. So I can retweet, or have you got that? Brilliant, thank you. Thanks, Julie.
And Julie, I think you had a question, so do you want to...
I do, but I just want to, just add to this thread of conversation about collaboration and outsourcing of your childcare. We used to think that was, as a verboten, we shouldn't do it, but I can just so relate to Hannah's recent experience, what you were saying about your husband. I just spent a month on the road doing deep research, international research based with newsrooms in the Philippines and India and South Africa. My husband's back in Oxford with my 9-year-old, working a job that doesn't have normal hours. Childcare is impossible, we're away from family. So what we ended up doing was I basically triaged before school and after school pickups and taking her to football through the amazing football community that we found in under 10s football club in Oxford. These women and men were incredible, and they were cheering me on, going, how's it going in the Philippines and wherever. He has taken her to work this weekend because I'm here, and he, interestingly, got the email. He works in one of Oxford's establishment bookshops, and he got an email just querying why it was necessary, to bring the child to work. So I do think we have to check that, because for us to be able to do this work that we do, our children have to still feel loved and still feel cared for and still feel part of our lives. That's all I want to say, and I don't want to say anything else. Off you go.
These networks are so important, but I think we're only probably going to get so far unless the workplace culture changes, and it's especially difficult to change it when it is the news industry and journalism. And Rachel, clearly ITV has done some amazing stuff and it's quite far ahead from others, and I think things like mandatory vacation is something that's becoming more of a thing in the US as well. But in terms of, and if there are other sort of people in management in the room who have tips or ideas or things that you have done in your newsrooms to improve things, you should jump in. But also, Rachel, how did that change come around? What was it down to? Was it down to individual managers who said, okay, this is not working, or why did it happen?
I think it's a combination. So I think there was the recent impetus of the gender pay figures, which we had to publish, but that probably sped us up. But we were moving in that direction anyway, partly because of female managers, but also we just had some really good women journalists who were in danger of losing from senior positions if we couldn't be more flexible. And some areas of news, particularly in TV news, are easier than others to go part-time. We have a lot of shift work, so you can still have quite a senior role as a news editor or a program editor because somebody has to be in every day. So you can do 3 days, you can be part-time. We're also keen to make sure the top jobs, which traditionally aren't part-time, could be as well. So we have political correspondents who are part-time. We have editors, our health editor, our social affairs editor. And, if they're off, they're off. We find a different way to cover the stories. So that's good, and it needs role models, and it needs the will. And quite often people say, well, that's not possible. So you say, it is possible. We'll just find a way. Or we'll find somebody else to act up those other days. And, it's all workable if you've got the will for it. But still a long way to go. And I will say, I am a bit tough on some things. If you want to work 10 till 2, or you want to always pick up and drop off, that's probably not possible in a TV news organisation. But if you want to work hard and be good, but maybe not all of the week, that is more possible. But there's some stuff that you just can't do, and we have to be realistic about it.
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, it's working. I'm just wondering, as someone starting out in the news, how do you manage the work-life balance there? Because I've been doing work experience for ITV in the West Country, and that's how I did this. And I used my lunch break to go to the hospital before coming back to finish the day. And I found myself doing 52 hours a week with nothing really. I had a package that went to air, but it's still, none of it has your name on it. You're not... but you give up your entire social life to anything. I get home 7:30 after the news is aired, and then have to make lunch for the next day, and then go to sleep to be up to do it all again the next day. So how do you manage that when you're at the very beginning?
It is really hard, and obviously I don't want to say that's absolutely fine. If you've been working 52 hours and breaking your foot and all that, that's obviously awful. But everyone starting out, I think, in a lot of industries does do work experience, and it's such a good way in. And I know there's a lot of controversy about unpaid internships, but there is still room, I think, for doing some work experience. You are in there now, and if there's a big story, you'll get sent on it, and you're getting all that experience. I really hope that you're building up something for your CV from it. So yes, a package has gone out without your name on it, but that is something for your CV now, and something you can talk about, and you now have a load of contacts. I probably can't advise on how to have a work-life balance, because like you at that age, I was working double shifts, day in, day out. But that's sort of part of it, and it was fun, and I loved it. So if you're enjoying it and it's taking you somewhere in your career, then I think go for it. And, I don't know, see your friends late on a Saturday night or something. But it's not going to last forever, and you will get to a place where there is more balance. But it is tough, and there's a lot of industries like this, which is tough.
I would add, which is the efficiency that comes from that, right? So knowing that the work isn't lessening. It's not a shift job where, oh, okay, it's 6 p.m., now I just hand this off to someone else. I will say, on the upside of this, I think we get more done and are more responsible with our time. Like, I'm never going to see, or very rarely am I going to see a colleague who's doing, like, online shopping, hanging out on the web, because we simply don't have the time, and we have sort of other things that we value. I also am a little bit wary, and this is actually something that comes out of education. There's a lot of criticism of sort of, well, it's just resilience. Like, all we need is just resilience, because I think then it becomes an easy way not to look to managers, not to look to corporations, to say, no, actually things need to be changing. And so the thing that I would encourage is, yes, it's fine to talk about this here, but to even begin thinking, like, who are the 2 or 3 people that I'm going to chat with on my team or across my organization about this when I get home from Italy?
I would just add that if you're working, I don't want to criticize. I don't want to criticize at all. I am worried if you're working 52 hours. I'm worried if you have to go to get medical treatment in your lunch hour. And I would encourage you, if there's somebody you can find who you might regard as an ally, to say, look, I'm feeling like this is a lot. I'm very committed. But I think sometimes it's okay to try to find a way to raise that. And also, it's much easier for me to say this, obviously, because I'm not starting out. I've learned to say no. I've learned to say no a lot. And sometimes it scares the crap out of me. And I still say yes too much. But I think sometimes legitimately you can do a better job with something if you can say no to something else. Sometimes it's not an easy answer.
I'm really happy to chat more afterwards if you want.
Yeah, go ahead. Okay, sure.
Can I go? You've touched on some very specific issues, so juggling, I think parenting with work, burnout, which can come from both the exhaustive news cycle and the sort of pervasiveness of social media. I guess maybe to add a little bit of a lighter edge to this. So a few years ago, a friend of mine told me that a colleague of hers had decided to do an experiment. And he realized he had, when he was at work, he was always planning ahead, thinking ahead, putting things in the diary, figuring out what to do. But when it came to his personal life, he was the one who was always really spontaneous, letting things sort of drop in. And he decided that for 1 year, he was going to just walk out the door. He was still going to work really hard, but he'd walk out the door, and then he'd just really focus on his personal life. And it sounds almost trivial. And what he found was that when he did that, he thought, oh, why am I not planning more things? I love music. And he, sought out different music shows and really thought about what he'd do with his holidays. And said it was absolutely transformative in a short period of time. And unsurprisingly, he also felt like he had a different perspective at work. I wouldn't use the sort of term balanced in an artificial way, but he felt like as his life became richer, as he basically invested in his interests, he saw the world differently. And so I'm really curious if we can also, for just a second, set aside the difficulty of the news cycle and social media, but also talk about how we fit in jobs into what I think are hopefully healthy and varied lives, and how you do it. And I bring him up because he told his colleagues what he was also going to do. And I've seen instances in which people are very explicit with their boundaries at work. And interestingly, how much more people seem to abide by it and respect it. So if you have any other ideas for sort of hacks or approaches, I'd love to hear them.
It sounds like we're all quite control freaky, aren't we, as journalists? And we try and sort things and organize. It sounds like he's put that to his home life as well, which is probably not a bad thing. I mean, certainly we have lots of interests and like to do a lot. We don't really stop. And we will book things and book things in. It's always a bit like your islands as well, isn't it? So you are doing that. But we all like culture and people and different experiences. And I think, bring that into your home life as well. And it sort of fits in with it. It's quite a good balance, I would have thought.
And boundaries. I mean, it's okay to set boundaries. I think. Sorry, that wasn't on, was it? It's okay. It's still not working, but it's okay. It is. It's okay to set boundaries. I think, very rarely will you. I think you're likely to get pushback much less than you worry. Is that even English? Do you know what I mean? You might think you're going to get pushback, but actually chances are you're not going to get pushback as much as you think.
Can I just elaborate on that? I mean, I was always very bad. I mean, I'm a very boring person who has no hobbies because my work has always been my hobby. And I could never really find anything more interesting than work. And the social life just blended into that. And it was having children that kind of gave me a little bit of sort of something else that, So I think journalists are inherently bad at that because we are obsessed with our work. And that's what makes us good at our work as well. And I think that's just the reality we have to accept. But Rachel, this is foremost the question for you. Where does the responsibility of a manager kick in to recognize in someone that person is, that person has not set those boundaries and needs them? Because we are very bad at saying no, especially when it's on a story that matters.
Yeah, we are bad at saying no. So I think, as I was saying with Brexit, we are realising that people are hitting that point. So we are just gently sitting down with everybody and checking they're okay and making sure they're not cancelling all their holidays. There's other things. When I got to the position of editor a few years ago, I became very aware that we're all really bad at just emailing when something's in our head, and that might be midnight because we're up and we're thinking about something and we splurge it and we get our thoughts out, and that's fine. When you're a manager and you're an editor, you can't do that because people feel they have to reply. So I think we have some responsibility in that kind of thing, and I really try not to email people over the weekend and set those sorts of boundaries. But again, I can't tell you whether most of my colleagues are having a nice home life, and I don't think you can on all that. But there are some things you can respect, and I have given jobs to people who, for example, play semi-professional sport, and we said, right, we'll ring fence you that time to make sure you can do it. So when people come to you with that stuff, you can. But I don't think I can know the ins and outs of everybody's life and making sure they've got a balance.
There is a Gmail plugin called Boomerang that does exactly what you mentioned, where, I just had a thought, I need to tell my colleague about it, but actually I'll schedule the time when he or she gets it. And so it's like this nice, it's off my plate, and I know that they will get it. I just want to really fast circle back before the next question to the sort of the always on, and the idea that it's okay to delete Instagram.
Exactly what I did today.
I think it's just something to consider for your own mental well-being. My mom was a reporter at the Chicago Tribune, and she always said, Emily, you're so lucky because you can leave the office. And I said, yes. I also can be reached at almost any time. And so I do think it's like worth taking a historical look that we're neither at the best or the worst place in the history of this field for the topics that we're talking about.
Yes, at last.
I just wanted to say that this is, of course, a very important conversation. But looking around the room and looking at you, the panelists, it tends to be one that's very often led by women. And I feel like I'd love to hear from you guys. I'm also a parent too. How do we get more men at the table discussing this and thinking about it together? Because I just feel like the onus ends up sometimes being on women to think about this.
I think this is a question for some of the men in the room. So who would like to answer it?
Maybe I can try.
Thank you.
How would I start? I feel that this conversation is a little bit confusing for me, actually. And I don't really know why, because this is a theme that's quite actual for me. I was burnout when I was 22 and a student of journalism, just starting in the working field. I was overworked 6 years later, and I asked myself, what is happening here, and will this be my rhythm for the rest of my professional life, which has stopped, thankfully. And that's started, and that's what is confusing me in this conversation. When we say it's okay to do something different, it's a reaction on how things are supposed to be in our working field. And when we say it's normal in our profession that we are busy, it's normal to work a lot because that's what you do when you start in this business. I found out for myself that I need to make my own definitions of what I think is normal. And I discovered that this is a part of being a professional. So it's a matter of professional identity, actually. So you can just react on what everyone is thinking that's normal, of what you think is normal for everyone else. You should start from now on to make your own definitions of what you think is normal and what is good for you. Not in just an individual, as an individual matter, but you should just start with what is a good working week for me? What do I like? What do I want? And that's a unique definition for for every one of us. And well, I started to make my own definitions by saying, I will not answer in a minute on apps, or I stop checking my Twitter because I don't need it. And I discovered that a lot of things I did, I thought they were normal in the business, and it was needed that I needed to do it, but in real life.
We have another. Yeah, that's a very valid point. We have another raised hand in the back. Yes, I think that's you. Yeah.
I'm just, for the benefit of everybody else, I'm Rachel's husband. So I just thought you should all know that before I say anything else.
The long-suffering husband.
Well, but it's in answer to the question that got raised at the front about this being about women and not about men. I'm just going to say, for everybody's benefit in the room, I work for Al Jazeera. I cover European news, and I've been put more or less in charge of our Brexit coverage for the last few months. I'm currently at the end of taking 2 weeks off with stress from work, and that's because the same reasons partly that Rachel raised about everybody being knackered, but you know, my employer does not seem to understand that, you know, there are any limits to what they're allowed to get me to do, you know, and to the point, Hannah, that you were making about if you raise a flag, then it's okay because your employer will understand. Potentially, you know, it reminds me of a hostile environment course that once went on in Gaza, where the army was there, and the guy said, "Look, if you see a helicopter, then put your hand up because they've come to rescue you." You know, the Palestinian journalist said, "No. If the helicopter comes, it's because the Israelis are going to drop a bucket of rocks on us." You know, and it doesn't automatically mean if you raise your hand, you're going to get the right answer. And it's not about the point I wanted to make, and the reason I've said all these things is it's not about women and men. You know, it's not that I think probably women are more tolerant, better managers potentially than men are, by and large, but it doesn't automatically follow. It's not about women and men, and it's not about how well you as a person think, how resilient you think you are. It's about the tolerance of your employer and whether or not they have any ability to function properly and allow you and to have any understanding of the limits of what they're prepared to do to you.
So and thank you for. I mean, I spent a long time contemplating whether to admit my vulnerability, and in many instances I didn't because I didn't think it was appropriate. I took 3 weeks off last summer from stress. I went to the doctor and I said it was burnout. She says it doesn't exist on the forms. They can't sign you off for burnout. They can sign you off for stress. I went back and tried to ask for more, and it was a really tricky situation. I've worked with colleagues from most of the main news organisations in my previous job, including Al Jazeera and Sky and ITV, etc., and there are different levels, certainly, of tolerance. And I hear what you're saying, and I really thank you for raising that.
Yeah, thanks, Lawrence, because I think it's so important that we don't actually make it this conversation about gender. I think it's very emblematic that we are all women, because I think more women in management position here at the table, and it's a conversation that was actually initiated by women, because I think men have, also additional pressure of not being vulnerable, and I think this is where you can learn from women, and what you clearly are able to do it without as well, and I think that's so important. There was another. Yeah, go ahead. Oh,
we have to wait for the mic because of the camera.
I just wondered what environments you try to foster in an office as well, because personally I worked in offices for 7 years as a staff journalist in London, and where I live now in West Africa in Senegal. I quit a year ago to go freelance, started doing TV and radio, and spend a lot more time outside of an office. I work longer hours, I have fewer days off, but my anxiety and stress levels have plummeted, and I feel much happier at work, and part of that is management. I'm my own manager, I have more control, and part of that is also the physical environment of an office sometimes is corrosive for your physical and mental health, and I wondered how you think about this as women in positions of power, how you improve those conditions, because for me it was transformative to just get out of that building.
Sure. Yeah. I wonder if that's partly echoing what the man there said, that I think part of that's about you and the individual, and there are lots of jobs that are very hard to get, and there's lots of jobs that are very sought after, but there are a range of jobs within this, and that's brilliant for you, that being out on the road brought your stress levels down. I've also done events, I think I've done some with you, where freelancers feel really vulnerable and their stress levels are up here. So I think it is setting your own boundaries and working out what's best for you, and brilliant if you were able to follow what works for you. I think probably organisations like mine that have been around for quite a long time, we've had decades of doing it badly, so we're beginning to do it a bit better. There are other organisations that are newer and still finding their way. And then there's other startups who have probably right from the beginning thought about stress levels and the way their staff work, and have maybe brought that into the culture and approaching it differently. So I think it's about what works for you, but also that the organisation does have a responsibility for making sure that there's not one size fits all, and we're looking at all the different bits of it.
I agree with that completely. When she joined our team at New York University recently, my colleague Ariel Zorolnik brought something with her that I think she borrowed from Quartz, which is a user guide to working with me. and it's about 7 questions, including things like, you are most likely to, as a colleague, to see me delighted when, ellipsis. You are most likely to drive me crazy when. And so writing these for each other and sharing them even with our extended team of freelancers just became this great way to know, like, oh, you do your best work between 7 and 10 p.m. I can't work then, but that's really good for me to know for assignments and also talking about what is your preferred form of communication, whether that is in the office, which a lot of people actually want to be out of the office because they're being interrupted less, whether that's with Slack, text messages, emails, etc. I think just asking, like, what is the best way to reach you with different types of messages is just a really important and empathetic question.
I would say also, sorry, just one final thing. I work from home a lot of the time, which sounds, I mean, I have a lot of people saying to me, oh my God, that sounds amazing. I mean, a lot of the time it is amazing, but it's also very isolated. And one of the triggers for burnout is feeling isolated as well. So it's not to say that one is like this absolute silver bullet. It isn't. There is no absolute to dealing with this.
This is kind of more of a kind of add-on point than a question, but if I think of a question, I'll add it in. I'm a full disclosure here. I'm the husband of Natalia, so.
Spouse is anonymous.
All the men are planted.
Yeah. But the thing I wanted to say was I used to be the BBC's correspondent in Baghdad and also in Kabul. And I would say it was impossible to do those jobs with any kind of balance. You know, there was no work-life balance. My life was my work. And I got totally burned out by doing those jobs. And so I had to take a lot of time off after I finished in Baghdad. The thing I really wanted to say was, and what I was certainly no good at doing, was in recognizing when that point came. And I think you have to accept if you want to do those kinds of jobs, you are not going to have a lot of life outside or any kind of normal life outside of doing those kinds of jobs. So you've kind of got to have a bit of a plan to know kind of how far you want to go and to be able to sort of like say, okay, this is enough, because actually your employers are probably, even though they, employers know, they talk about this stuff a lot more than they used to, but they still don't really get it. They still don't really understand. You've got to look after yourself. The one thing I would say, and this is actually a sort of little kind of acknowledgement of gender differences. I think women, the women at the BBC, my female managers at the BBC were much better at sort of thinking of these issues than the men were. But I think in the end, you've kind of got to look after yourself if you want to do these kinds of jobs.
But there's something in that. I mean, I think a lot of managers learnt the hard way, not as hard as the staff, through a lot of bad management of people going in and out of Baghdad particularly. And I really hope that's not repeated again. It won't be got right with whatever conflict comes up next. But I think you're right that when you appoint somebody to go and do that, we ought to be thinking about the exit point as well. And that almost needs to be as important as the going in. And maybe that's something for future that we all need to think about much more. We won't have exactly the same scenario again, but we always used to, if we went off to war zones, think about a bit of R&R on the way out, and that's done then if you go to Dubai and have a few cocktails, and that's fine. But we need to be thinking more seriously about the long-term effects of it, and that exit out, I think, definitely.
Thank you. This is just a comment going back to the question about what men can do in the workplace to help women. And one thing that I've discovered in my prior workplaces is that women end up being responsible for or just expected to take on many of the culture building or social planning, the extra emotional labor, like of a workplace, like remembering birthdays. Like, whose birthday is it? Who needs to buy the birthday card? Who's going to go and plan like the party? Who's going to organize the happy hour? And you know, a lot of this emotional labor just happens to fall on women, even if it's not, you know, ever codified like in like an employment like handbook or like, you know, employer's guide. And I think that one thing that men can do to help women is that, you know, be aware of this emotional labor and please like volunteer. If you know someone's birthday is like coming up, volunteer to get the cake. Like volunteer to get the card and to get everyone to sign it. Volunteer to like help plan the summer outing. And maybe in some workplaces there are specific employees or, you know, departments that are responsible for that. But in many other workplaces, especially smaller ones, it just falls on often a female employee. And I think we just all need to be cognizant of that and be willing to like step up and like, you know, help out with that kind of like extra labor that we end up doing and often kind of takes away time from like women to do like their actual jobs that might like help them advance. So that was.
Yeah, that's a great point. We have time for one more question, I think, or do we not? We don't have time for one more question, but thank you so much for coming. Thank you for this amazing table. And please, let's follow up on Emily's suggestion to have a crash at Perugia next year.